desert in late summer had a way of testing a soul. The heat rose in shimmering curtains off the red stone, and the horizon always seemed to slip farther away, the longer a man looked at it. Dust devils spun like restless spirits, dancing across the canyon floor before breaking apart in silence. It was a country of silence, of wind and rock, and the sun beating down so hard it made the skin crack and the tongue swell. That was where the drifter found her, alone on the edge of the desert's gates, half hidden by a tumble of sandstone and sage. She was slumped against the rock, her dress torn, lips split and dry, and her eyes barely open to the daylight. The world had already done its best to take her. The drifter stood a while, letting the scene settle. He'd seen plenty of men broken out here, too proud to admit defeat until the sand swallowed them whole. But there was something different in this one. Her hands trembled, as if still trying to fight. She hadn't given herself over yet, though she was near the edge. He dropped his pack beside her and crouched low, the leather creaking with the movement. His canteen was half empty, precious as any gold, but he unfastened it and pressed it against her lips. At first she didn't move. Then, with the faintest stir of life, she drank. The water ran down her chin, soaking the dust that clung to her skin. She coughed, shivered, then drew in a breath sharp as broken glass. "Easy," the drifter muttered, steadying the canteen in his rough hands. His voice was quiet, not the kind that demanded, but the kind meant to anchor. Her eyes flickered open, hazel flecked with sun, though clouded now with exhaustion. She looked at him as if unsure he was real, as if the desert had played some last cruel trick before it finished her. "You're not," she whispered. But her voice failed, collapsing into silence. "No," he said, understanding. "Enough without the words. I'm not whoever left you here." The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of dry creosote and the faint taste of storm far to the west. Night would come before long, and with it the chill that could kill as quick as the day's heat. The drifter knew one thing with certainty. If he left her there, she'd not see another sunrise. And though his life had been built on walking alone, the desert had a way of stripping men down to the truth. Sometimes you couldn't leave another soul behind. He pulled his coat from his shoulders, the canvas worn and dusted from 100 miles of trail, and draped it across her frame. Then he set his jaw and began to plan the long walk ahead. Because in this land, mercy was measured not in words, but in how far a man was willing to carry another through the dust. The drifter tightened the strap on his pack, eyes fixed on the canyon rim that cut against the sky. A half-day's climb and another full day's walk lay between them and the nearest trading post, if his memory of the maps in his head still held true. Out here, the land had a way of changing, trails swallowed by sandstorms, landmarks toppled by time. He glanced down at the woman again. The coat swallowed her frame, making her look even smaller than she was. She had the build of someone once strong, someone who'd worked the land or the stock, but hunger and heat had carved her down to skin and bone. He thought of leaving her, not with cruelty, but with the cold arithmetic of survival. His water was low, his food nearly gone. 2 mouths meant the desert would take them both. He had lived long enough to know when the odds weren't kind. But then she stirred. Her lips moved, faint and cracked, shaping something. He leaned closer, catching the whisper. "Don't let them..." Her voice fell into the wind, but it was enough. The words weren't just pleading, they were defiance, the last ember of someone not yet willing to be swallowed by the dust. The drifter straightened, jaw tightening. He knew that kind of ember. He'd carried it himself once, when the world had tried to break him. A soldier's war, a trail of graves, debts that could never be paid. Still, he'd walked on, not because life promised kindness, but because some part of him refused to yield. He slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her slow. She was light as dry wood, but limp, her head resting against his chest. He adjusted her weight, shifted his pack across his back, and stood steady on the red stone. The sun hammered down as he began the climb. The canyon walls rose around him, jagged and cruel, the kind of place where men disappeared without a sound. His boots ground against loose shale, sending pebbles skittering into the depths. Each step was deliberate, muscles straining, breath controlled. He moved like a man who had learned the hard way that haste killed quicker than the desert. By the time he reached the rim, shadows were stretching long, the sky burning red gold with the dying day. He lowered her to the ground, kneeling beside her, and listened for the faint rhythm of her breath. It was there, ragged but stubborn. The wind shifted cooler, carrying the promise of night. He gathered brush, dry as bone, and sparked a fire to life. The flames caught quick, licking upward, casting their glow against the endless dark. She opened her eyes then, barely. The firelight painted her face, softening the ruin the desert had made. She studied him a long while, as if trying to anchor herself to this stranger who had plucked her from the dust. "Why?" she asked at last, her voice rasping, the question raw as open skin. The drifter looked into the fire, silent for a long spell. Sparks cracked and leapt skyward, joining the first faint scatter of stars. "Because," he said finally, his voice low, steady, "I know what it means to be left behind." The desert stretched out around them, vast and merciless, but for the first time in a long while, he felt it didn't ours. And the night, not while that fire burned, and not while she still breathed. The fire crackled low, its flames licking the brittle brush he'd gathered, its glow fighting back the weight of the desert night. Coyotes called in the distance, thin and lonely cries that echoed through the canyons. The drifter sat close, his back to the wind, sharpening his knife against a stone, not because he needed it sharper, but because the steady scrape kept his thoughts from drowning him. Across from him, wrapped in his coat, the woman stirred. She had not spoken since asking him why. Her breaths had been shallow, punctuated by fits of coughing, but now she shifted, and her eyes opened wider than before. They glinted in the firelight, weary yet steady. "You should have left me," she rasped, her voice dry as dust. "Would have saved you the burden." He looked up from the blade, his face unreadable, then slid the knife back into its sheath. "Maybe," he said, "but I didn't." She studied him, as though weighing whether that answer was enough. Her lips cracked when she tried to speak again. He offered the water skin, tilting it carefully so she could drink without spilling. She took it, swallowed, then let her head rest back against the stone. Her silence stretched, broken only by the pop of the fire. Then she said, so soft it might have been to herself, "They wanted me gone." The drifter's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "My own kin," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Brothers by blood, though you'd not know it by how they looked at me. They said I carried shame into the house, shame they couldn't scrub out, no matter how they tried. So they bound my wrists, tied me to their mules, and dragged me out past the river, left me where the canyon falls into the desert, told me the sand would finish what they couldn't." Her voice wavered, but not from tears. Her eyes were too dry for that. Instinct. It was the kind of break that came when a wound was spoken aloud for the first time. The drifter's jaw tightened. He stared into the fire, the muscles in his hand flexing against his knee. He'd seen men abandoned in battle, comrades left bleeding in the mud because a captain deemed them not worth the risk. That same brand of betrayal lived in her words. "You walked with them for years, didn't you?" he asked. "Trusted them?" She let out a bitter laugh, the sound cracked and sharp. "Trusted? No, but I thought blood was blood. Turns out it's just another word for rope." The night pressed closer, heavy with her confession. The drifter leaned back, pulling the brim of his hat low to shadow his face. For a long while he said nothing, only listened to the wind as it rattled through dry sage and carried grit across the stones. Finally he spoke. "Blood don't make a family. Choice does." His voice was quiet, edged with something she couldn't quite name. "They chose to cast you aside. I chose to pull you out." She turned her head, staring at him through the glow of the fire. The lines on his face were rough-hewn, carved by years of dust and distance, but his eyes, though tired, held no judgment, only the same stubbornness she had carried in her whisper when she begged not to be left. "Why keep carrying me?" she asked. "You don't even know my name." The drifter reached for a stick, prodding the fire until it flared brighter. His answer came slow, deliberate. "Don't need your name to know you've been wronged, and I reckon I've still got a little strength left to lend." The desert stretched wide around them, but in that moment it felt smaller. The night pressed in tight, like the world itself was listening. She closed her eyes, letting the heat of the fire seep into her bones, and for the first time since being cast out, she allowed herself to believe that morning might come. The dawn rose blood orange, painting the canyon walls in fire as the cold night surrendered to the merciless heat that would follow. The drifter stamped out the last embers of the fire, then slung his pack across his shoulder. His coat still wrapped the woman, though it sagged heavy on her slight frame, and he bent low to lift her once more. Her weight pressed into him, weaker than the day before, yet every step he took stirred a grit of determination deeper into his stride. The desert was no place for mercy. By midday, the heat bore down like a hammer. Sand shimmered and swam, each step stirring dust that clung to sweat and leather. The drifter paused at a dry riverbed, crouched, and scraped at the cracked earth. Nothing. Not a drop of moisture. He swore under his breath, his voice low and ragged, then turned his head toward the jagged ridges in the distance. "There's water up there," he muttered, though whether to her or himself, even he wasn't sure. The woman stirred faintly. "You can leave me," she whispered. His jaw set like stone. Already answered that. She fell quiet, watching him with sun-hollowed eyes. Something in the lines of his back told her he'd walked these wastes before, that he'd known thirst like a knife in the gut, and loss that gnawed the bones long after the wound was gone. They pressed on. Each hour stretched like a mile. The drifter's boots bit into the sand, leaving shallow prints that the wind rushed to erase. The horizon shimmered, taunting him with false rivers that vanished the closer he walked. By the time the sun slanted low, his shoulders burned from carrying her, his breath harsh in his throat. He found shade at last, a cluster of stone outcroppings where a thin sliver of darkness carved itself against the dying light. He lowered her gently, setting her back against the rock, then crouched beside her. "You keep me alive at your own cost," she said, her voice cracked but steady. "Why?" The drifter looked at her, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He reached for his canteen, shook it, and frowned at the hollow rattle. Only a swallow left. Without hesitation, he tipped it toward her lips. She drank, weak but desperate, before he pulled it back and corked it tight. "Because," he said, slow and deliberate, "a soul don't survive alone out here, and I reckon neither of us should have to." The woman stared at him, her chest rising shallow, and for a moment the silence between them was heavier than the desert itself. Then the sound came. Hooves. Distant, muffled, but sure. The drifter froze, his hand drifting to the worn revolver at his side. The woman's eyes widened. "They've come," she whispered, terror straining her voice. "My brothers? They'll not let me live." The drifter rose, squinting toward the horizon where the sun bled into purple shadow. Dust rose in the distance, a small plume carried by riders. He flexed his hand on the grip of his revolver, then looked down at her. His voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "Then they'll have to cross me first." The desert wind stirred around them, carrying grit and the scent of approaching danger. The outcropping was no fortress, just rock and shadow, but it was enough. The drifter knew how to stand his ground, and this time, he wasn't standing for himself. The riders came slow at first, a cloud of dust moving steady along the rim of the canyon. The drifter crouched low, one hand braced against the hot stone, eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. He counted 3, no, 4. The silhouettes were jagged against the dimming horizon, rifles slung casual, as though they were in no hurry. The woman pressed herself tighter against the rock. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "I told you, they don't stop. Not for law, not for God, only blood." The drifter slid his revolver free, the weight of it cold in his hand. Good thing I've bled before. He studied the land around him. The outcropping was jagged, pocked with cracks, enough to crouch behind but not near enough to be called cover. Beyond it, nothing but open sand and canyon wind. He had one advantage. The riders thought she was still theirs to CLA him. They didn't yet know the ground had shifted beneath their boots. The first rider reined up just 30 yards away, his horse pawing the sand. He was a rangy man with a scarf drawn high over his mouth, the kind of face made for cruelty. His eyes flicked to the woman, then back to the drifter. "You're far from home, stranger," the man called, his voice sharp as flint. "That one's not yours." The drifter's voice came low, steady, a man who didn't need to shout. "She's not yours either, not anymore." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread among the riders. Another man spat into the sand. "Then hand her over. Won't be no need to waste bullets." The drifter's thumb eased over the hammer of his revolver, the faintest click sounding in the heat. His eyes never left the leaders. "Son," he said, "I've buried men for less than that tone." For a long heartbeat, silence stretched. Wind hissed through the canyon, carrying sand like whispers. The woman clutched at her coat, her heart thudding loud enough she feared it would give them away. Then one rider kicked his horse forward, just enough to test the man standing against them. The drifter's revolver barked once. The shot echoed off stone, a flash of fire in the half-dark. The rider pitched sideways, his hat flying as he tumbled into the dust, his horse bolted, reins trailing. The other three scattered their mounts, rifles snapping to their shoulders. The woman shrieked, ducking lower against the stone, and the air cracked with bullets striking sparks from rock. The drifter rolled hard to the side, landing on one knee, his revolver bucking again. Another horse reared as a man toppled, crashing into the sand with a scream. The drifter's chest burned with each breath, but his eyes were cold iron. "Run if you want," he called, his voice carrying over the gunfire, "but you ain't taking her." The two remaining riders curtained, Cled wary now, eyes flashing in the dim. They weren't reckless anymore. They'd seen enough to know this was no drifter stumbling blind through the desert. This was a man who fought like he had nothing left to lose. The woman pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the drifter's back. For the first time since the night she'd been dragged from her home, something strange stirred in her chest. Not just fear, something else. Hope. And hope, she realized, was its own kind of weapon. The gunfight didn't last long, but its echoes clung to the stone walls like ghosts. Two men lay where they'd fallen, one face first in the sand, the other groaning faintly, pinned beneath his horse. The other two pulled their mounts back, circling wide, keeping out of range. The drifter stood slowly, smoke curling from the mouth of his revolver. His chest rose and fell, steady, though sweat glistened at his brow. He tipped the cylinder open, sliding fresh rounds into place with a calmness that made the woman shiver. "They'll wait for night," he muttered, snapping the chamber shut. "Desert evens the odds when the sun goes down." She swallowed, her throat dry. And if they wait? What then? The drifter tugged his hat lower, eyes fixed on the circling shapes beyond the canyon dust. "Then they'll try again. And I'll still be here." As twilight bled across the horizon, the desert grew colder. The heat sank into the stone, leaving the air sharp, thin, and bitter. Coyotes called from somewhere far off. The two surviving riders set up just out of sight, their campfire throwing flickers against the canyon rim. A warning, a promise. The woman huddled close to the rock, her hands wrapped tight in the drifter's coat. She could still feel the thunder of gunfire in her bones. Every sound, a stone shifting, the rustle of dry brush, made her flinch. The drifter knelt by a shallow hollow, coaxing a small flame from dry mesquite. His movements were quiet, deliberate, as though he'd done this 1,000 times. When the fire caught, he set his revolver across his lap and let the glow light his weathered face. "You've done this before," she whispered, not quite asking. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, he fed another twig to the flame. Only after a long silence did he answer, "More times than I'd like." She studied him in the shifting firelight. The lines at his eyes weren't carved by age alone, but by grief, by battles fought and never spoken of. Her voice trembled when she spoke again. Why help me? You don't know me. You could have walked on." He lifted his gaze then, steady and unflinching. "Because I've seen what happens when men like that get what they want, and I've carried enough regrets through these canyons to know." He stopped, jaw tightening. "Some debts you don't leave unpaid." The woman lowered her eyes, clutching his coat tighter. She didn't ask about those debts. She didn't need to. Above them, the stars came out one by one, cold and endless across the desert sky. The two of them sat by the fire in silence, listening to the night breathe. But even in that silence, the threat was close. Two riders waiting in the dark, patience sharp as their knives. The drifter shifted, checking his revolver once more before setting it by his side. Then he leaned back against the rock, hat tilted low, as if he could rest even with death stalking them from the shadows. The woman lay curled by the fire, her body trembling though the flames licked warm. And yet, for the first time since her world had burned, she felt something fragile she hadn't dared let herself feel, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore.